Throughout history, civilizations rise in moments of brilliance, and sometimes collapse just as suddenly. Egypt's Old Kingdom was one of humanity's greatest triumphs. Along the fertile banks of the Nile, pharaohs commanded immense power. They raised pyramids that pierced the desert sky. Temples overflowed with gold and sacred ritual. Cities thrived with priests, artisans, and merchants. The pyramids of Khufu and Khafre towered above the plateau of Giza like mountains of stone, symbols of a civilization that believed its kings were divine. To the people of Egypt, the pharaoh was more than a ruler. He was the living link between humanity and the gods. Through him, the Nile flooded, the crops grew, and Ma'at, the sacred order, governed the world. For generations, this system seemed eternal. Yet even the mightiest kingdoms are not immune to time. Slowly, Egypt's foundations began to weaken. Royal authority faded. Provincial governors, the nomarchs, grew stronger, ruling their regions like independent kings. The immense resources once commanded by the pharaoh were no longer limitless, and nature itself seemed to turn against Egypt. The Nile no longer flooded with its usual abundance. Some years the waters rose too little, leaving fields dry and cracked beneath the sun. Harvests failed, granaries emptied, hunger spread quietly at first, then relentlessly across the land. The magnificent pyramids of Giza still stood in silent majesty, their massive stones unchanged by the turmoil below. But they had become relics of a distant age, reminders of a time when pharaohs commanded the labor of tens of thousands and the wealth of an entire kingdom. Now that power was fading. Temples that had once overflowed with offerings saw their stores diminish. Priests who had sung hymns of eternal prosperity now faced uncertainty. Across the Nile Valley, local rulers competed for influence. Rivalries grew into open conflict. Armies clashed not in defense of Egypt, but in struggles between ambitious regional powers. Villages were abandoned. Trade routes faltered. Families who had lived peacefully for generations found themselves caught in instability and fear. Egypt had entered what historians would later call the First Intermediate Period, an age of division and hardship. Yet even in this time of turmoil, Egyptian civilization did not disappear. In scattered cities along the Nile, traditions endured. Priests continued their rituals. Scribes preserved knowledge. Communities adapted and survived. And slowly, far to the south in Upper Egypt, a new center of power was rising, the city of Thebes. Here, ambitious rulers dreamed not of ruling a single province, but of restoring the unity that had once defined Egypt. Among them emerged a man whose determination would change the course of history. His name was Mentuhotep II. He would become the king who ended the age of chaos. And with him, Egypt would begin its long journey back toward greatness. Egypt was divided. For decades, rival rulers controlled the Nile Valley. From the chaos of this fractured land, a new power began to rise. In the north, a rival dynasty ruled from its capital at Heracleopolis. In the south, another force was gathering strength in the ancient city of Thebes. The land that had once stood united under a single pharaoh was now divided into two rival kingdoms. Between them stretched a fragile frontier, a boundary not only of territory, but of ambition. In Thebes, a new royal dynasty had begun to gather strength. These southern kings claimed the ancient traditions of Egyptian rulership, presenting themselves not merely as regional governors, but as true heirs of the pharaohs. Among them rose a ruler whose ambition would reshape the destiny of Egypt. His name was Mentuhotep II. The most prominent king of the 11th dynasty, which reigned from around 2134 to 1991 BCE, marking the beginning of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep inherited a divided kingdom. The north and south stood locked in a long struggle for dominance, and the unity that had once defined Egypt seemed a distant memory. But Mentuhotep possessed something rare among the rulers of his time: patience, determination, and a vision that reached beyond his own city. For years he strengthened the power of Thebes, the southern capital located near modern-day Luxor. Armies were organized. Alliances were forged. Slowly, the southern kingdom prepared itself for the inevitable confrontation. When the moment came, the conflict was decisive. The armies of Thebes marched northward along the Nile, confronting the rival rulers of Heracleopolis, situated near modern-day Beni Suef, in a struggle that would determine the fate of Egypt. At the same time, Mentuhotep himself represented the rising 11th dynasty of Thebes, making this war a clash between two royal houses. The details of the battles have largely been lost to history, but their outcome would change the course of Egyptian civilization. Mentuhotep emerged victorious. After generations of division, Egypt was reunited under a single king once more. The long age of chaos was finally coming to an end. With this victory, Mentuhotep II became the first pharaoh of a new era, the Middle Kingdom. For the people of Egypt, the restoration of unity was more than a political triumph. It was the return of order itself. In Egyptian belief, the stability of the world depended upon the balance known as Ma'at, harmony between the gods, the king, and the land. During the years of division, that balance had been shattered. Now, it was restored. Mentuhotep established his authority across the entire Nile Valley, from the delta in the north to the borders of Nubia in the south. But reunifying Egypt was only the beginning. To ensure that the kingdom would never again fall into such chaos, the new pharaoh began rebuilding the institutions of royal power. Provincial governors were brought firmly under the authority of the crown. Administration was reorganized. Trade networks were restored, reconnecting Egypt with distant lands. The Nile once again became the great artery of a united civilization. Yet Mentuhotep also understood the importance of symbolism. If Egypt was to believe once more in the divine authority of the pharaoh, the king needed to demonstrate that the age of greatness had returned. And so he turned to one of the most powerful traditions of Egyptian kingship: monumental architecture. But the age of the Great Pyramids had passed. Instead of building another massive pyramid like those of Khufu or Menkaure, Mentuhotep created something entirely new. On the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, across the Nile from Thebes, he built a remarkable mortuary complex unlike anything Egypt had seen before. Terraces rose one above another, connected by long ramps and colonnaded halls. The structure blended temple and tomb into a single monumental design carved into the living rock of the desert cliffs. It was both a statement of power and a declaration of renewal. Egypt had survived its darkest age, and now a new chapter of civilization had begun. The reign of Mentuhotep II marked the true beginning of the Middle Kingdom, a period that would bring renewed stability, prosperity, and cultural achievement. Yet even as Egypt flourished within, forces beyond its borders were beginning to stir. But history rarely moves in straight lines. In the generations that followed, Egypt would rise to extraordinary heights once more. Trade expeditions would travel to distant lands. Great irrigation works would transform the fertile basin of the Fayum. Magnificent temples and monuments would appear across the Nile Valley. Yet beyond Egypt's borders, new powers were emerging. Peoples from the eastern deserts and the lands of the Levant watched the wealth of the Nile with growing interest. And centuries later, these outsiders would bring Egypt face to face with one of the greatest challenges in its long history. They would be known as the Hyksos.
Thank you for walking this journey through time. Until we meet again in the next chapter of the Pharaohs' history.